Return of the Jedi was the final film in the original Star Wars trilogy. Released back in 1983, Return of the Jedi has been praised for concluding one of the most popular film trilogies ever made. In this video, we're gonna dive deep into the history of this film nearly 42 years after its release. We'll cover the production of the film and how it all came together. We'll dive into the themes and the story of Return of the Jedi and how it holds up as a Star Wars movie. We'll cover how the film changed over time with Lucas's special edition changes, and we'll wrap up the video by looking at the reception of the film. So let's travel back in time to 1980 and look at the production of Return of the Jedi. Similar to the first movie, The Empire Strikes Back was a major success for George Lucas. While the film didn't make as much money as its predecessor, it was still more than enough for Lucas to get himself out of debt, build his companies, and more importantly, conclude his trilogy. Lucas had thoughts of continuing the Star Wars saga for much longer than 3 films, but because of how hard making these films was and how much it was taking out of George, he decided he would wrap it all up with the trilogy, for now. While a lot changed for Lucas, a lot also didn't change. Lucas would continue to fund his Star Wars movies from his own pocket, maintaining his independence and refusing to work with the studios. Right as Lucas began working on the 3rd film in the trilogy, he faced his first challenge. Lucas and Irvin Kershner were being sued by the Directors Guild of America for the opening credits in The Empire Strikes Back. Usually, it was commonplace for director and actor credits to be listed in the beginning of the movie, not in the end. With the original Star Wars, since Lucas directed the film himself, the Directors Guild let him get away with this. But because Irvin Kershner directed The Empire Strikes Back and not Lucas, crediting Kershner at the end of the film violated DGA guidelines. Lucas said this on the matter. They said Lucasfilm was a personal credit, not a corporate credit. My name is not George Lucasfilm any more than William Fox's name was 20th Century Fox. On that technicality, they sued me for $250,000. You can pollute half the Great Lakes and not get fined that much. Lucas would pay all the fines, but because of this, he decided to leave both the Writers and Directors Guilds. In typical George Lucas fashion, he wanted his independence wherever he could get it. But gaining his independence from the guilds came with its own set of problems. After The Empire Strikes Back, Irvin Kershner told George he would not be returning for the 3rd film, stating that he already devoted 2 years of his life to Star Wars and wanted to move on. Lucas had plenty of ideas for a director on his 3rd film. His first choice was his good buddy Steven Spielberg, but because Lucas was no longer a part of the guilds, he couldn't hire anybody from the guilds either. Unfortunately, Spielberg was a part of the guilds and therefore could not direct Star Wars. Finding a director was challenging for Lucas, not just because his pool of candidates was small, but also because people often saw themselves as better than Star Wars. None of them wanted to direct the popular kids film. Lucas was looking for a non-union, young, and flexible guy that would follow the Star Wars tradition. So he settled on documentary filmmaker Richard Marquand. He had also recently finished directing Eye of the Needle in 1981. Lucas was impressed with the film and chose Marquand to direct Star Wars 3. The film Revenge of the Jedi was announced, with Marquand to direct and Kasdan returning to write. Principal photography would begin in January of 1982. The first title Lucas had in mind for Star Wars 3 was Return of the Jedi, but Kasdan and Kazanjian, his producer, thought the title was weak, so Lucas changed it to Revenge of the Jedi instead. With a director chosen, it came time to draft the script for the movie. Many early drafts had the same concepts that made it into the final movie. One concept was something that Lucas had thought of all the way back in 1975, and that was this idea of a primitive species defeating a technological force. Clearly inspired by the Vietnam War, Lucas wanted the 3rd Star Wars to reflect that. Initially, Lucas had planned on making this primitive force the Wookiees, but later on Lucas changed it to the Ewoks. When asked why Lucas chose Ewoks instead of the Wookiees, Lucas had this to say: "I didn't make Endor a Wookiee planet because Chewbacca was sophisticated technologically, and I wanted characters involved in the battle to be primitive. That's why I used Ewoks." Even though this is the official word from Lucas, other theories exist. Some believe that making a bunch of Ewok costumes was cheaper than Wookiee costumes, and some, including his lead producer Gary Kurtz, believed Lucas chose Ewoks because Ewoks would sell more merchandise. Another aspect of this film that existed all the way back in the early drafts drafts was the relationship between Palpatine and Vader. When discussing this dynamic with his writer and director, Lucas can be heard softly writing the main plot of the prequels. Lucas explained Vader and Palpatine's relationship like this. No, he, Palpatine, was a politician. Richard M. Nixon was his name. He subverted the Senate and finally took over and became an imperial guy, and he was really evil, but he pretended to be a really nice guy. Luke's father gets subverted by the Emperor. The president is turning into an emperor, and Luke's mother suspects that something has happened to her husband. She is pregnant, Anakin gets worse and worse, and finally Ben has to fight him and he throws him down a volcano and Vader is all beaten up. It is so fascinating that Lucas had this idea for the prequels all the way back in 1981. Now, almost none of this made it into Return of the Jedi, but this dialogue shows how much thought Lucas put into Star Wars and how far ahead he planned. In these early drafts, Palpatine posed a much more direct threat to Vader than in the final version. In the final movie, Palpatine's threats to Vader are a lot more subtle. This part of the early drafts was changed later on. Vader killing Palpatine was also in these early drafts, implying that Vader's redemption was always a part of the story too. The other part of the story that was there from the beginning was this idea of a second Death Star. But originally, instead of orbiting some random moon, the Death Star would orbit the Imperial capital Had Abaddon. This idea of invading the Imperial capital was scrapped since Lucas felt it would be too challenging for the rebels to invade the Imperial capital. Luke's sister would be introduced in Star Wars 3 as well, fulfilling the ideas Lucas had come up with when drafting The Empire Strikes Back. Initially, Lucas wanted this to happen way later in the series, but because he condensed his original vision into a trilogy, he just made Luke's sister Leia. In early drafts, this revelation felt a lot more organic, mentioning Luke's sister came from Alderaan. The main differences of the film stemmed from Han and Leia's role. Initially, Leia would not be present in the opening act where Han would be rescued, and then after Han was rescued, Luke and him would discuss the potential love triangle they had between Leia. This leads me to believe that Leia becoming Luke's sister wasn't agreed upon until way later in the drafting process, but that's just speculation. Lucas was also unsure if Harrison Ford would return for Star Wars 3. Many know this is why Han was put into carbonite at the end of The Empire Strikes Back. Just in case Ford wouldn't return, the writers could kill him off. Ford was not under contract, unlike Hamill and Fisher. Because of this uncertainty, Han was not a part of these early drafts, but eventually producer Howard Kazanjian convinced Harrison Ford to return. Once Harrison Ford was back, he and Gary Kurtz felt that Han should die to add emotional weight to the story, but of course Lucas disagreed, believing that Star Wars was a fairy tale first and foremost and that the trilogy needed a happy ending. Lucas still always believed in making children's movies, and that included a happy ending above all else. Because of this decision, and Lucas making the Ewoks a big part of the movie, Gary Kurtz decided to leave the project, thinking Lucas was far more concerned with merchandise than storytelling. Kurtz said some of these original drafts had bittersweet endings, and this was also tossed aside for that happy ending. The third draft of the script was done in December of 1981, and filming on Revenge of the Jedi began in January of 1982. Unlike the previous two films, there were no major challenges in this production. On-location sets were all built in the United States, so Lucas didn't have to worry about traveling to places like Norway or Tunisia, but there were still a few minor problems. Since Star Wars was so popular, companies would often price gouge Lucas if he wanted to film at a location or use certain equipment. So in order to keep the production a bit more secretive and to not get overcharged, the production said they were working on a movie titled Blue Harvest Horror Beyond Imagination. No one had interest in this Blue Harvest, so Lucas and his team were left alone. There was more secrecy to this movie too. False scripts were given out, and when it came to plot points, actors were on a need-to-know basis. Mark Hamill had this to say about the secrecy of Star Wars 3. As soon as I was given the script, I was told which scenes were false. They were only willing to tell me that in person, rather than over the phone or in a letter. It was all a part of the fun. It set me thinking about what the real scenes could be. Star Wars 3 would be much bigger than anything before, with more assets, along with new technologies like making the speeder bike chase. During production, there were rumors that Marquand clashed with the cast. Supposedly he clashed multiple times with Anthony Daniels of all people, and at one point made Carrie Fisher cry. But these are just rumors. When it came time for the post-production, the VFX was still the biggest struggle. Even though ILM had 2 films of experience under their belt, Lucas wanting to go bigger than ever before canceled that experience out. It was reported that ILM was working 20 hours a day for 6 days a week on Return of the Jedi. Supposedly during test screenings of the movie, there were big issues with the sound quality, so Lucas founded a new company, THX, effects to make sure all theaters playing his movie would have the new sound system. Just prior to the release, Lucas revisited the title of the movie. He decided to go back and titled the film Return of the Jedi because Jedi don't take revenge. After a long and tedious production, Return of the Jedi was released in theaters on May 25th, 1983, 6 years after the release of the first film. All things considered, the production of Return of the Jedi was not as bad as the previous two films. Did that lead to a better movie? Well, let's dive deep into the story of Return of the Jedi and find out. But before continuing on with the rest of this video, only 17.1% of viewers are subscribed to this channel. So if you're enjoying this video, please consider subscribing for more content like this. Thank you. Return of the Jedi is an interesting film. For one, most people seem to think of the film as the weakest in the trilogy. I mean, it's pretty hard to compete with one of the most influential and successful movies ever made, and one of the best sequels ever made. But even though most say Return of the Jedi is the weakest of the trilogy, that's still not largely reflective of how good the film was. Some people say it lives up to the rest of the original trilogy, others say it was just a fine film. What do I think? Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag. What I find so strange about Return of the Jedi is the structure of the film. Usually in most movies, you can divide it into a 3-act structure. Act 1 sets up the story, Act 2 raises the stakes of the story, and Act 3 is the climax where the story is resolved. With Return of the Jedi, you certainly have 3 acts. What's the problem? Act 1 doesn't set up the rest of the story. It's almost as if it's a completely different movie. If you look at the other 10 Star Wars movies, each one of these first acts sets up the plot for the rest of the film in some way, but not with Return of the Jedi. So the movie begins with Vader arriving at the Death Star. He tells Jar Jar Rod the Death Star needs to be completed faster, and the Emperor is personally coming to the Death Star. This sets up what the plot of the rest of the movie is going to be. A second Death Star needs to be completed, the Emperor is personally going to be there, and the rebels need to stop him. Great! We then cut to Tatooine, where for the next 32 minutes we follow the main gang rescuing Han Solo and killing Jabba the Hutt. None of what happens here is relevant to the rest of the movie. There's no new MacGuffin introduced here, there's no new characters or storylines, nothing. All that's accomplished here is that Han is rescued. Now you might get frustrated with me trying to downplay Han being rescued. He's a key part of the rest of the movie, right? Well, not really. Han is present during the Battle of Endor, sure, but narratively the story doesn't do anything with him. Does Han have an arc? No. Does his relationship with Leia develop at all? Not really. All that happens on that front is that he tells Leia he loves her. Was there something about Han that was instrumental in destroying the Death Star? No. A great way to determine if a character is important to a storyline is by asking yourself this question. If you take a character and replace them with another character, does the storyline change at all? In A New Hope, if Leia was the one who swooped in and saved Luke before he blew up the Death Star, would the movie change? Absolutely. The whole point was that Han got over his selfishness and saved the rebels in the end. If this moment was given to Leia, it just wouldn't make sense. If in The Empire Strikes Back, you replaced Han with Lando, would the storyline still make sense? No. Why would the Empire test the carbonite chamber on Lando? The bounty hunters don't care about Lando. Now let's do Return of the Jedi. If you were to take Lando and put him on Endor instead of Han, does the storyline still make sense? Yeah, nothing really changes. Sure, we would lose out on some of the romance scenes between Han and Leia, but narratively, Lando could very well have been the one to blow up the shield generator and no storylines are changed. So the entire point of this tangent is that, while fun and entertaining, rescuing Han doesn't impact the rest of the story. If I cut out the entirety of this Tatooine sequence, and I have someone mention in a throwaway line that Luke and Leia rescued Han, would the story be missing anything? No. There's no character development for Han you would be missing. There's no character development for Leia that you would be missing. There's no key plot development you would be missing. There's no character development for Lando, Chewbacca, 3PO, or R2 that you would be missing. Nothing was acquired that would help the rebels win the Battle of Endor, so nothing happened. The only thing that you could argue we would be missing if the Tatooine sequence was cut out was seeing Luke's development as a Jedi, which is important, so I'll give you that, but there are plenty of other ways the story could have shown us the development of Luke's training. The easy way to fix this problem would be by making Han instrumental to destroying the Death Star, or winning the Battle of Endor as a whole. now. Let's do a mini rewrite. Say the rebels know they need to infiltrate the Death Star in order to destroy the core, but they mention that no one in the rebellion is good enough to fly through these tight corridors. Leia then mentions that Han could do it. The rebels then give Luke and Leia the green light to go rescue Han. Han is then rescued, and then when he returns to the rebels, Han agrees to make the flight through the Death Star while Lando goes to Endor to destroy the shield generator. When the time comes, Han successfully flies the Falcon through the Death Star, blows up the core, destroying the Death Star, and the rebels are victorious. Let's go back to the questions I was asking before. In my little rewrite, could Han be replaced with any other character? No, he couldn't be replaced, because the movie and the trilogy as a whole established that only Han Solo is good enough to fly a ship through the Death Star. Since Han is crucial to the plot of the movie, rescuing him in the first act actually has consequences later on. So, the Return of the Jedi we know begins with a 30-minute sequence that, while fun, doesn't really matter. And this is one of my biggest issues with the movie. The first act is not relevant to the rest of the plot. Now, some of you may criticize me for hating fun. Oh, you're reading too into this, stop overanalyzing the movies and just have fun. Fair enough. Let's pretend everything here on Tatooine was relevant. How is it as a sequence? It's fun as hell. Of all the action sequences in the original trilogy that aren't space battles, this is the one that's the most impressive. Jabba's palace perfectly encapsulates this aspect of the Star Wars world. I'm talking about the aliens, the music, the grittiness, the style of the ships, all of it. The action here is well shot, it's well scored, and it's well acted. You cannot call yourself a Star Wars fan and not get pumped when Luke grabs the lightsaber from R2. This scene was awesome. I do need to go on one other big ass tangent before we move on. This scene was partially ruined for me when someone pointed out that the plan to save Han makes no damn sense. For all you prequel haters trying to find plot holes in those movies, or you sequel haters trying to find plot holes in those movies, I ask you to explain to me what exactly was Luke's plan. Here is everything we know. Firstly, at some point Lando snuck into Jabba's palace and is pretending to be a dude who works there. This actually turns out to be completely useless, but whatever. Then 3PO and R2 go to the palace so Luke can give them to Jabba as a gift. You may think the reason Luke did this was so R2 can hold on to Luke's lightsaber and give it to him at the appropriate time, but more on that later. So now that R2 and 3PO are Jabba's property, Leia comes in and cashes in on Chewbacca's bounty. The assumption here is that Leia can sneak in successfully and rescue Han. So she does that and then tells Han they gotta get the hell out of there. But Jabba saw it coming and the plan failed. Let's pretend for a second that this initial plan worked, where Leia and Han could have just walked out of there. Now they have to worry about rescuing Chewbacca, R2, and 3PO. I guess you could argue that Lando, who is undercover, could have rescued the three of them. I don't know if I find that to be feasible, but let's pretend that it is. Let's say that was plan A. Have Leia just walk in, rescue Han, and then Lando rescues the rest. Clearly they had a plan B, because then what would be the point of sending in the droids? The droids have no relevance to plan A. So if Leia's rescue fails, then plan B starts with Luke just walking in and facing Jabba. He threatens Jabba, and then when Jabba doesn't budge, he takes someone's blaster and tries to shoot Jabba, which doesn't work. Was his plan here to just kill everybody and then walk out with his friends? That seems like a pretty dumbass plan. If the reason for sending in the droids was so R2 can give Luke his lightsaber, why didn't he ask for his lightsaber here? But either way, Luke fights the Rancor, wins, and then they are all set to be executed by the Sarlacc pit. There is when Luke is able to get the lightsaber by R2 and fight away everyone. So here Luke is living under some pretty strong assumptions. Assumption 1 is that they would be sent to be executed by the Sarlacc pit instead of just getting blasted on the spot. Assumption 2 is that Han and Chewbacca would also be sent to be executed. That's a safe assumption, but still quite risky. And assumption 3 is that R2 would be in a position where he could shoot Luke's lightsaber into the sky so Luke could grab it, where he would then kill everyone and save his friends, which kinda happens. He was pretty lucky that Jabba needed R2 on the sail barge of all places. So plan A was to have Leia walk in and rescue Han, and plan B was to have Luke walk in and kill everyone. I feel like Luke should have just ditched plan A and just did plan B. Another strange part of this plan is that they didn't appear to tell 3PO any part of the plan, because the whole time 3PO is clueless. It seems like they only did this so 3PO can be a proxy for the audience. So yeah, this whole plan either either makes no sense or is a terrible plan. So that's my rant on this entire opening sequence. It has great moments and it is excellently filmed, but when you put the logic of it upon an ounce of scrutiny, it all falls apart. So considering this entire Tatooine sequence isn't really necessary and it doesn't make sense, the movie is not off to the best start for me. So now we get to the rest of the movie. And similarly to The Empire Strikes Back, the movie is divided into two storylines: Luke's storyline and Han and Leia's storyline. Let's cover Luke. Luke's story in this movie is mostly wonderful. It contains some of the best Star Wars that has ever existed, but it also has a few funky moments. So shortly after rescuing Han, Luke returns to Dagobah to fulfill his promise with Yoda. This scene with Yoda is really sweet at times. Yoda says goodbye, he confirms to Luke that Vader is his father, and then Luke briefly chats with Obi-Wan where he learns the truth about his sister. First and foremost, I find it a bit anticlimactic that Luke hadn't returned to Dagobah up until this point. In Empire, Yoda is begging Luke to stay and complete his training. A year passes, Luke has done some of his own training off screen, and then he returns to Yoda and Yoda says, "Oh, your training is complete, you just need to confront Vader." It makes me question how important Yoda was if Luke was able to do most of his Jedi training by himself. So the scene with Yoda has the emotional beats it needs, but when I think about the broader implications of this scene, there's no plot holes per se, it just leaves me scratching my head. I do like the confirmation from Yoda that Vader is Luke's father. Supposedly back in the day after The Empire Strikes Back, many viewers simply refused to believe Vader when he said he was Luke's father. So this moment exists to definitely tell the audience, no, Vader is definitely Luke's father, he is not lying. I like that. So then Obi-Wan talks to Luke where he briefly talks about Anakin, and then Luke figures out that Leia is his sister. This is a strange thing to critique since Leia being Luke's sister has been a thing longer than I've been alive, but frankly the way this reveal was handled was terrible. I hate when the Force is used as an excuse to conveniently serve the needs of the story. Obi-Wan refuses to tell Luke who his sister is, but Luke can magically use the Force and just tell Leia is his sister, despite there being no hint of this whatsoever. It's silly. In some of the behind the scenes material that I mentioned earlier, in the original drafts, Luke is talking to Yoda about his sister, and Yoda mentions that Luke's sister was brought to Alderaan. Then Luke is kinda able to put the pieces together and figure it out. Even that is a bit of a stretch, but at least there's some lead there. You may argue that Leia using the Force in Empire is evidence for Leia being Luke's sister. Yeah, I don't agree. Considering that when Empire was made, Leia wasn't going to be Luke's sister, it's hard to use something in that movie as evidence. Leia being Luke's sister is also one of those things that I don't like, but that decision has led to future stories that I do like. If you're a fan of the EU, so much of what happens in the books after Return of the Jedi depend on Leia being Vader's daughter. If you're a fan of the sequels, Kylo Ren only works as a character if he is the grandson of Vader, so it puts me in a bit of a pickle to say I don't like Leia being Luke's sister, but I also love the story elements that resulted from this decision. It's like the Clone Wars. I hate the prequels, but I love the show that spun off from the prequels. I get why Luke needed a sister, so Vader can threaten him later on, and since Leia is the only woman in these movies, Lucas had no other choice. I just find this reveal and the way it was handled to be lazy. Now we get to the rest of the movie, and it's not an exaggeration to say that Luke redeeming his father is my favorite storyline in all of Star Wars. When I think of Star Wars and the reasons why it means so much to me, I think of this moment right here. Luke rejecting the Emperor and saying, "I am a Jedi like my father before me." Let's rewind a bit though. What this movie does excellently right away is show the audience that Vader is not the same as he was before. In the previous two movies, Vader was ruthless, showing no mercy or weakness. Here, however, he's a bit more passive. Just the way he talks to the Emperor, you can tell something is off. Like when Palpatine says, "I wonder if your feelings on the matter are clear." Okay, that's something to think about. When Vader and Luke meet again for the first time, there's so many great moments that show us again that Vader is conflicted. Like when he says, "It's too late for me, son." The way James Earl Jones acts that line gives us hope that it isn't too late. I used to be a lot more critical of Vader's redemption. I thought it was a bit convenient that after 2 movies of being ruthlessly evil, he just grew a soft spot and was now redeemable, but I think this movie alone does a good job at planting those seeds for said redemption. From Luke's perspective, however, it begs the question, why does he think there is good in Vader? This is the first time in the entire trilogy that there is any hint that Vader could turn good. Luke hasn't seen Vader since the last movie, at least that's the assumption. What reason does Luke have to believe there is still good in Vader? If Vader wasn't Luke's father, would Luke have any reason to believe there is good in Vader? No. Vader's redemption wasn't rushed, but Luke's faith in Vader's redemption was rushed a bit. Maybe if if Luke said, "I don't know if there's any good left in Vader, but I need to try," then it would work a bit better for me. But in the current movie, it seems like the only reason Luke believes there is good in Vader is because Vader is Luke's father. Either that, or he somehow sensed Vader was good before he was leaving Cloud City, which The Empire Strikes Back didn't convey at all. I know I'm being a bit too nitpicky. Everything from here on out, though, I have no complaints. So Luke and Vader confront the Emperor, and Palpatine's manipulation of Luke was perfectly written. In The Rise of Skywalker, Rey shows up and Palpatine is like, "Join the dark side or I'll kill your friends," and then Rey agrees. In this movie, the same thing pretty much happens, but Palpatine's manipulation is a lot more gradual. He's repeatedly taunting Luke over and over again until the point where Luke snaps. Instead of there being an ultimatum, "Join me or your friends die," Palpatine is like, "Your friends will die, and your anger over that is going to turn you to the dark side." That works so much better, and it makes the scene so much more interesting. Luke snaps, and we get what is probably the most emotional lightsaber fight in the franchise. Vader is going through emotional turmoil, and Luke is doing everything he can to save his father. When Vader tries to manipulate Luke and tells him that he would turn Leia to the dark side, Luke freaks out and just unleashes on Vader. The music that plays in the background is just brilliant. It has this ominous tone to it that increases the intensity of the scene. So many times in Star Wars, we see these over-choreographed fights that, don't get me wrong, look great, but seeing Luke just hack and whack at Vader feels so real. When you look at this trilogy and the saga as a whole up to that point, this scene is not only the culmination of Luke's arc, but also Vader's arc. For Luke, he began this trilogy as a farm boy, and told Obi-Wan that he wanted to learn the ways of the Force and become a Jedi like his father. He used the Force at the end of the first movie, but it wasn't until the second movie where he really began his training. He was impatient and reckless, and it cost him a great deal when he lost the duel to Vader. The temptation of the dark side was always there too, just as Yoda had warned him. Come Return of the Jedi, everyone is telling Luke that he needs to kill his father if he wants to become a Jedi. In the past, Luke was told to trust his instincts, but here his instincts are contradicting what his masters are telling him. They're telling him to kill his father, but Luke simply cannot do that. So instead, Luke trusted in himself and trusted his instincts. In this moment where he pretty much embraced the dark side, he decides to reject it unlike his father and declares himself a Jedi. He won't strike down his father and he won't succumb to the dark side. Empire Strikes Back Luke could never be this patient. This is the culmination of Luke's arc throughout the trilogy, but also Luke's arc in this film alone. Luke doesn't have a standard character arc. He has what's called a flat arc. In a flat arc, a character has a belief, and that belief is tested throughout the whole movie. Usually at the end, despite how hard it was, the main character maintains the belief and is about to change someone else. In the case of Return of the Jedi, Luke believed that he could save his father. Everyone told him not to, and even at points Luke doubted himself. But when the time came, Luke stood strong, and because of it, he was able to save his father. Masterful stuff. Palpatine is electrocuting Luke, and Vader has to make a choice. In the way he looks back and forth, you can tell how conflicted he is. Vader, after nearly 20 years, decides to make the right choice and save his son. He returns to the light side and defeats the man responsible for so many years of torture, and he gets to say one last goodbye to Luke. I love when he tells Luke, "Tell your sister you were right about me." It's a really beautiful scene. But to take a step back for a second, the reason why this scene is so beautiful is because Luke showed unconditional compassion. It was Luke's unconditional love for his father that brought him back to the light side. Star Wars is about love, family, redemption, hope, and so many other things. This scene with Vader and Luke encompasses all of that in such an amazing way. Vader's redemption and death is not only the best scene in this movie, but it's the best scene in the entire saga. Sure, I have some issues with Luke's arc as I stated before, but when the culmination of that arc is the best thing in all of Star Wars, I can't help but love it. So thank you, George Lucas, for everything in this storyline. Now we can get to the rest of the movie, more specifically the story revolving around Han and Leia. I've already hinted at this before when I was ranting about Han's relevance, but neither Han nor Leia have much to do in this movie. Again, yes, they are present in a lot of the movie, and they're instrumental to taking out the shield generator, but there's no richer story here, no thematic exploration. Everything Han and Leia do here is external rather than internal. What do I mean by that? External goals are goals usually related to the plot. Internal goals are a lot more personal. With Han and Leia, they have external goals. They want to win the battle and defeat the Empire. They have no internal goals, however. In The Empire Strikes Back, sure, they wanted to escape the Empire and survive, but their internal goals have to do with developing their relationship and confessing their feelings for each other. This is why Han's capture is so devastating. Again, There is none of that in Return of the Jedi. After covering the production of this movie, it's quite obvious why this ended up being the case. Since Lucas wasn't sure if Harrison Ford would return for the movie, he didn't include Han in early versions of the script. By the time Harrison agreed to return, it was too late for Lucas to rewrite the script and make Han a key part of the story. Since Han and Leia aren't fundamental parts of the story, there's not much for me to analyze here. Sure, the action is great. I'm not much of an Ewok hater, so I don't mind them defeating the Imperials. The space battle is probably the best space battle ever put to screen. The effects still largely hold up, and the tension and pacing here is great, but that's pretty much it. So, Return of the Jedi. The movie has a lot of highs. It actually has the highest highs of all of Star Wars, but it also has a lot of mediocrity. The Tatooine sequence, while fun, is kinda pointless and makes no sense. Luke's story is fantastic and contains the best Star Wars to ever exist, but Han and Leia are sidelined so all the emotional weight can be given to Luke. Now, just like we did with the previous two movies, we need to look at the special edition of Return of the Jedi. So let's dive deep into the changes and see which ones work and which ones don't work. The special edition changes of Return of the Jedi are a lot closer to A New Hope's changes compared to The Empire Strikes Back's changes. It's a close one between whether A New Hope or Return of the Jedi has more changes, but I think Return of the Jedi has the bigger changes. Most of the changes right away take place during the beginning of the movie, and again, just like with the other two movies, I won't be covering every single change, just the major ones. The biggest change in Jabba's palace has to do with the change to the song that plays. I won't be playing the song due to copyright reasons, but originally there was the song Lapty Neck that played, and in the special edition it was changed to Jedi Rocks. Along with the new song, there are a bunch of new CGI shots with new creatures. I don't mind the song change necessarily, but the CGI aliens look terrible. The CGI in these special editions have not aged well at all, and the aliens here are no exception. The scene where Ula screams as the Rancor approaches her was actually a scene filmed solely for the special edition. Lucas brought back the original actress and filmed the scene with her screaming in the Rancor pit. I would prefer this scene not be here, but I don't mind the change. Other changes during the sequence include new shots of Boba Fett, a wider shot to the front door of Jabba's palace, and of course the tentacles added to the Sarlacc pit. Honestly, any change that doesn't have CGI I'm fine with. I just hate the CGI additions to this movie because it looks so out of place with the rest of the movie. There were so many great practical and real sets, but then you see outdated CGI and it takes me out of the movie. The last notable change during this Sarlacc pit sequence are some added shots of the Tatooine landscape. These are fine, no real complaints here. Most of the changes in this movie take place on Tatooine, but of course there are notable changes elsewhere. On Endor, there was a change so Ewoks can blink now. I'm not joking, and I never actually noticed this before. The biggest Endor changes are of course at the end. Instead of the old Yub Nub song, we have the Victory Celebration song. Victory Celebration is one of my favorite bits of score in the Star Wars franchise, so I love this change. What I don't love are all the added shots of Tatooine, Naboo, and Coruscant. I get it. With the prequels, Lucas wanted this moment to feel like the culmination of all 6 films, but again, these shots are all CGI and it doesn't look good. The last set of changes have to do with Darth Vader. The first big change is him yelling no right before he picks up the Emperor. I bloody hate this change with a passion. When making the prequels, Lucas felt the need to always have the characters say what their feelings are, something that wasn't present in the originals. But because Lucas couldn't help himself, he had to have Vader say no here. It's terrible. When we see Anakin's face, his eyebrows are now removed. I guess this makes sense with the continuity, but whatever. And the last major change is of course seeing Hayden Christensen instead of Sebastian Shaw. I don't like this change either, but since we saw Force Ghost Hayden in the Ahsoka series, I guess I have to live with it here. Just like the previous 2 movies, I will give my award for the best special edition change and the worst special edition change. The best special edition change goes to the song change from Yub Nub to Victory Celebration. Nothing against Yub Nub, but Victory Celebration is too much of a banger. The worst special edition change goes to Vader yelling no. It's a stupid ass change that somewhat degrades the best scene in all of Star Wars. And those are the special edition changes to Return of the Jedi. Let's wrap up the video by looking at the reception of the film. As of today, Return of the Jedi has grossed $482 million worldwide at the box office, with roughly $110 million of that coming from multiple re-releases. At least domestically, Return of the Jedi was the highest grossing movie of the year, grossing over $100 million more than the movie in second place. When it comes to the ratings, Return of the Jedi scored an 82% critic score on Rotten Tomatoes and a 94% audience score. This makes it the 6th highest rated Star Wars movie on Rotten Tomatoes. On IMDb, the film scored an 8.3 out of 10, which makes it the 3rd highest rated Star Wars movie on IMDb. On IMDb's best movies of all time list, Return of the Jedi is listed as the 93rd best movie ever made. What do you guys think about Return of the Jedi? Let me know down below. In a couple days, I'm gonna release a compilation of all 3 original trilogy films, and I'll include one more bonus section at the end, so stay tuned for that. Thank you everyone so much for watching another one of my videos. Don't forget to unite the Claude Squad, and I'll see you guys next time.